Hey everybody, it's Albert. A few weeks ago, I think it was on New Year's, I did a video response to the first 7 minutes of a rather long video by a YouTube user named South Somewhere entitled History is Not What You Think, or something like that. And my response was titled When Crackpots Breed, because that's what I felt this video was more indicative of, crackpots breeding, than anything of any importance historically. All sorts of misinformation in the video I'm responding to, and all sorts of nonsense, and I just felt obliged to it. Since someone had asked my response to this, I felt obliged to at least give 7 minutes, or originally I was going to do 10, but after 7 I just couldn't take it anymore, as this is so absurd. So I said I might get back to some of it, so I'm going to do some more, at least as much more of it as I can stand, and maybe come back to it again in the future. So right now this is When Crackpots Breed 2, the sequel. And if you haven't seen my previous video, When Crackpots Breed, you're going to really have to watch that one for this one to make any sense whatsoever. Since you'll be kind of walking in the middle of it. I'll have a link to my original video in the description below. So for now, if you haven't seen it, look at that one first. And if you have seen it, we're just going to pick up where I left off last time.
This document is estimated to be 3,500 years old, and it describes in detail the sinking of Atlantis.
To understand this, you would have to sort of see the end of my previous video. The reference here is to the Toronto document. And as I pointed out at the end of my last video, lots of crackpots following a guy who was a complete fraud in 1912 will say, you can look this up at the Toronto document in the British Museum, and there's a lot, you'll see this a lot on these crackpot websites about the Toronto document at the British Museum, and they'll say that it speaks about Atlantis. Well, first of all, the Toronto document doesn't speak about Atlantis at all. Zero, zilch, nada, not there, okay? Second of all, you can tell this sort of line of fraud because it goes back to a fraud in 1912 when some guy pretended to be the grandson of Schliemann, the guy who discovered Troy, and claimed that he had found where Atlantis was and said he had found it in, among other places, the Toronto document in the British Museum. That's what he said. Well, and that's where this comes from. The problem is that the Toronto document has never been in the British Museum. It's in the National Museum in Madrid, Spain. So what they're saying just doesn't make any sense. But this illustrates this person is copying a line of crackpots who haven't even figured out, even after 100 years of this guy being exposed as a fraud, that the document isn't in the British Museum because he says it is. And of course, it has nothing to do with Atlantis. But as for the other claims, no, it's not 3,500 years old or something like that. It's actually at most about 1,000 years old. It's from the post-classical period of Mesoamerican culture, or somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 AD. So it's around, at most, around 1,000 years old or so, maybe a little older, maybe a little less old. But that's pretty much the story on that. So this is just more nonsense.
To fill these two empty vortexes, according to Thoth, two extraterrestrial races stepped in. Not one, but two completely different races. The first race were the Hebrews, coming from our future. Thoth says that they came from off-planet, but we don't know where exactly.
Yes, folks, it's Jews from space! Shouldn't this be in a Mel Brooks movie? Look, I probably am not going to interrupt much when he starts blathering lunacy like this, other than to make snarky comments. So don't expect me to come up with some sort of factual data to prove that the Jews aren't a race from the future in another planet. I shouldn't really have to present such stuff. I will, however, point out that Thoth, for those who don't remember from the previous video, is some guy who gets channeled from some psychic or something. So you can see just about where the level of interaction with factual data is in this video. So let's just go on.
The Hebrews were kind of like a kid who went through 5th grade and didn't make it, so they had to do that grade over again. They learned all the math, the left brain stuff, but they didn't get the right brain aspect of evolving consciousness, the doing. They didn't graduate to the next level of evolution, so they had to do it again.
As if the Jews haven't had it bad enough already, I guess evolving consciousness doesn't grade on a curve.
They knew a lot of things that we didn't know yet and brought many concepts and ideas to us that we weren't aware of yet. Now, if this is true, this would explain quite a few things about the Hebrew people in general. They seem to have many sacred geometries hidden within their culture. It also puts perspective on the story of Exodus. Perhaps Moses incarnated into that lifetime to free the Hebrews because they were not direct descendants of humans and were being treated unfairly. Or could it be that Moses was visited by an ascended master of the Hebrews who guided him to free their people?
Or maybe Moses was Charlton Heston in a previous lifetime. It makes about as much sense of what he's saying.
Given what we know about dimensions and consciousness, it definitely puts a fresh perspective on old stories that didn't make much sense.
And this makes sense? Maybe if you're a loon.
We could talk about this more, but let's continue for now. There were no problems caused by the Hebrews coming to Atlantis. They actually benefited our evolution. The other race that stepped in caused big problems.
Okay, let's see who the villains are.
These beings came from the nearby planet of Mars.
What?
See, according to Thoth, Mars looked very much like Earth a little less than 1 million years ago. It was beautiful. It had oceans and water and trees that were just fantastic.
Dude, I hate to break the news to you, but Thoth, or the guy who pretends he's Thoth, is full of crap.
But something happened to them, and it has to do with something called the Lucifer experiment.
I know I'm going to regret asking, but what's the Lucifer experiment?
From the very beginning of creation, everything is simply an experiment. Creation itself was just consciousness creating and inhabiting itself in that creation. There is no divine plan. Spirit can do whatever it wants. Having said that, if Spirit decides to cut itself off from the rest of consciousness and create a separate reality on its own, it can do that too. This is called the Lucifer experiment. Because Spirit is God, it can do this. There is nothing wrong with that. We've kind of been led to believe that Lucifer is evil and the devil. This just isn't true. Lucifer is just another means of perceiving the reality. It is not a unity perception of oneness, but rather a duality perception of two-ness. There's a flower of life pattern for Lucifer as well, but that's a big topic for another time.
Yes, I knew I was going to regret asking that. Just for those who may be curious, the word Lucifer is Latin. It's not Greek or Hebrew, so it's not actually in the Bible. What it comes from is Jerome's translation into Latin of the Bible, which is commonly called the Vulgate. That's where it derives from. And what ended up happening was the Hebrew Hallel was translated as Lucifer. It turns out Hallel means the morning star, and there was an individual who was being called the morning star derisively in this passage, who was interpreted by many Christians as being the devil, Satan, and hence the term Lucifer, which actually means light bearer, but was commonly used as a colloquialism for the morning star in Latin, became associated as a title or name of Satan. So hence that it became a very strong association where Lucifer was often taken as the name, even though it was strictly through this translation. And then centuries later, the King James Version, rather than translating it, decided to transliterate it as Lucifer. It was Luciferus in the Vulgate. So they transliterated it as Lucifer, and that's where you get it. But it is not actually in the original text of the Bible in Greek or Hebrew.
Anytime the Lucifer experiment has been attempted in the universe, it always ends in failure. The species will cut itself off from love and will become incredibly male, left-brained. What always ends up happening is that everyone becomes very greedy. There is no compassion for one another, and everyone ends up fighting until they end up killing themselves. More than 1 million years ago, the beings on Mars joined the Lucifer experiment, and it failed dramatically. Basically, they cut themselves off from the unity of the universe and created a separate reality. When the Martians severed the love bond, they became pure male, logical beings with no emotions. What happened on Mars was that they ended up fighting. Mars became a battleground. Eventually, it became clear that Mars was not going to survive. They blew their atmosphere away and destroyed the surface of the planet.
Just so you can have a little touch with reality here, I'm going to give the explanation given by most scientists, and you can decide which one you want to believe. Basically, at one point, Mars had water, rivers, oceans possibly, and was a much more hospitable place than it is today, certainly. That would definitely be the case. Of course, it was a lot longer than 1 million years ago, as it's being explained here. And what happens, the difference between Earth and Mars is basically right now you don't see Mars having really any magnetic field to speak of, and the difference is that Earth does, and hence the magnetic field protects Earth's atmosphere from the solar wind, and that's why we're kind of okay and they're not. And the reason that Mars doesn't have this magnetic field around them any longer is actually because it's considerably smaller planet than the Earth, and the core was, of course, much smaller, and it cooled. And once it was no longer molten, it no longer produced that magnetic field that protects us, and hence, at that point, the solar wind comes rushing in as the field weakens and basically throws the atmosphere aside pretty much, or does a number on their atmosphere, and Mars becomes a desert, and that's pretty much what you see there today. So that's the scientific theory, and it was a lot longer than 1,000,000 years ago, so it's like in the much, much earlier. So you can decide which one you want to believe.
Nova recently did an episode on planetary magnetics, and they found some interesting things about Mars. The planet didn't have a magnetic system, however the surface was magnetized, implying that at one point it did, but that something happened.
Which, of course, I just explained and can be seen by the fact that if you look at Mars, there are remnants of what are obviously once were volcanoes, but Mars, in fact, has no volcanic activity. So you can pretty well guess what probably happened. Or you can think it was like a bunch of Martians blowing themselves up. I mean, you just take your choice.
Now, we've been discussing the star tetrahedron before, and now I want to give you a brief understanding of the Merkaba. The Merkaba was known in ancient times as the Chariot of Ascension. It is the star tetrahedral energy field around the body. All around the world, there are references to this in ancient texts. When activated to its full potential, the Merkaba, which is both a tool and part of your being, can be used to do the impossible, included but not limited to changing dimensions and traveling through the universe.
In reality, the Merkaba is actually a common ancient Near Eastern motif, which has God on his throne, which is on a chariot above the heavens, and it appears in many ancient Near Eastern texts, including Old Testament texts, and it generally is used in the Old Testament, for example, in various apocalyptic texts, most notably in, Ezekiel and things like that. So but it has nothing to do with geometric shapes or anything like what they're describing here. And in fact, those sorts of associations don't really happen until long after the New Testament period, through such practices as Kabbalah and things like that, which come much, much, much later. So obviously this person really has absolutely no idea what they're talking about.
Before Mars was destroyed, they built huge tetrahedral pyramids. They built 3, 4, and 5-sided pyramids, eventually building a complex that was able to build a synthetic Merkaba. After 1,000,000 years or so, it's been eroded, but the proof is there.
In case you're wondering, this has to do with basically some writings of a bunch of crackpots of the Richard Hoagland variety, dealing with things like the supposed face on Mars, and because basically what happened is that initially one of the spacecraft that went past Mars, which had a very low resolution camera, because this is much older technology at that point, saw pictures of things that kind of looked like a face, and this thing that kind of looked like a face, and then they saw these other things that kind of looked like pyramids, and then even though people were explaining like these are low resolution pictures, you're basically performing the looking for shapes in clouds trick, and you're just making associations that really aren't there. They ran and wrote books on it and appeared on various conspiracy theory radio programs of talking about the ancient Martian civilization and blah, and on and on and on. Well, it turns out that once they got high-resolution cameras to look at it, these just basically look like rock formations, which is, well, what they actually were all along. It's just that some people haven't got the message, so they sort of make this excuse, well, it's been eroded. No, it's a bunch of rocks. That's pretty much it. And, it's no sign of technology or anything. It's just what normally happens with rocks.
Now, because the Martians were severed from the Unity consciousness, they couldn't create a living Merkaba. They simply used it as a tool. They created a synthetic Merkaba to travel in time and find a new home. A small group of Martians tried to get away from Mars before it was destroyed, and that place they found was Earth. About 65,000 years in our past. They saw this little vortex sitting there, just pulling in life, with no one in it. They didn't ask permission. Being part of the Lucifer experiment, they just said, alright, let's do it.
So what you're telling me is the Martians were neocons?
And they stepped onto that vortex, and in doing so, they joined and changed our evolutionary path.
Okay, this little bit of lunacy seems like a good place to leave off for now. And next episode, when Crackpots breed 3, I'll pick up with the Martian invasion. Okay, so, but, until then, thank you very much for your time.